Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Full house. I love this. Good evening. My name is Jamie Boskett, and I have the privilege to serve as the president and CEO of your State History Museum. And I'm just thrilled to see so many familiar faces this evening for this wonderful tradition of ours. This is really one of the best events of the year. This is our 32nd annual J. Harvie Wilkinson Lecture. And 32 years. It's incredible. And I say this is one of the best of the year because this is the opportunity, through the generosity created for this tradition, allows us to bring in some of the finest speakers and scholars working in the field of American history today. And I think it's a testament to see the interest tonight and that we filled the house. This lecture is named in memory of a leading figure in the Virginia banking community, Harvie Wilkinson. He was respected in financial circles here and well beyond the Commonwealth. And he is also remembered, especially here, as someone who had a deep love and commitment for history and education. And that's why you combine these pieces together, and it's so fitting that this lecture be named forever in his memory, and that we continue to gather to learn more, to broaden our horizons on topics of great importance, both to Virginia, the United States, and the world. Before I introduce tonight's lecture, well, first, let me back up. I skipped over a piece there. I just want to thank the entire Wilkinson family. And Jay, you have just been an incredible, incredible advocate for the work we do here, our progress, both from your service on the board, but then your family's continued wonderful support. So if you would join me in thanking Jay Wilkinson and his family. And to connect those dots, and perhaps you've been to one of these lectures before to know that Harvie is Jay's father. Thank you. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I ask that you take a moment now and turn off anything that may make noise. Not sure what you brought with you, but turn it off if you would, and we'll all enjoy this next hour together. And as you're reaching into your pockets and making that kind of adjustment, I'll share a few updates of what's upcoming here at the VMHC. First, and in just a few days, in fact, Saturday, we'll open one of the largest exhibitions of Lego models anywhere in the world. I don't get to say things like that very often, so I enjoyed that. Traveling Bricks, as it's called, will tell the history of transportation through dozens of models made of more than 1 million Lego bricks. And it will be with us through the holidays, opening this Saturday through January, through the new year, and really a perfect treat for the history lover and the Lego lover in you. And of course, our reason for doing this is to mark the history-making move of the Lego Group to have their new U.S. presence here in the Commonwealth. And if you haven't already seen that exciting news, that Lego Company is building their first and what will be their only Lego manufacturing facility right here in Virginia in Chesterfield. So an exciting development and a great relationship. So come and tell others about this wonderful treat for the holidays. Also upcoming on October 25th, your VMHC will bring together more than a dozen local museums and community groups for a safe, family-friendly trick-or-treat event, which is made possible by our wonderful friends at Mars, another great Virginia-based company, who has just the other day, a tractor trailer showed up with, I think, nearly 50,000 pieces of Mars candy. So there will be enough to go around. So any candy lovers in your life, send them over here on Friday, October 25th for VMHC Trick or Treat. And I think it also is just a testament to the ways we have brought such life to this institution and embraced our community and everyone in it. Also, as part of our Leading to 50th initiative, remember, we're just now 2 years away from America's semi-quincentennial, and we have a robust portfolio of exhibits and programs coming your way. But 2 in the short term, on December 5th, we will welcome the CEO of the American Philosophical Society, Patrick Sparrow, to speak on his new book, The Scientist Turned Spy, Thomas Jefferson and the Conspiracy of 1793. On January 15th, we'll welcome ESPN senior writer David Fleming to speak on his new book, Who's Your Founding Father? One Man's Epic Quest to Uncover the First True Declaration of Independence. So study up and come so you can argue with him that evening. I think that'd be good. All right, now on to tonight's program. Tonight's lecture will paint a vivid portrait of General Dwight Eisenhower as he navigated the crosscurrents of diplomacy, politics, strategy, family, and fame with the fate of the free world hanging in the balance. Indeed, in a world of giants, it was a man from Kansas who would master the art of power to become a modern-day George Washington. Drawing upon meticulous research and an extensive body of newly discovered records, letters, diaries, and other first-hand accounts from across 3 continents, this evening's speaker brings Eisenhower to life as a complicated man guiding the grand arc of modern history. Tonight's lecture promises to reveal how Eisenhower both reflected and was integral to America's becoming of a global power. Joining us this evening to tell this incredible story is Michel Paradis. Michel Paradis is a leading human rights lawyer, historian, and national security law scholar. He is a partner at the international law firm of Curtis Mallet Prevost and teaches at Columbia Law School. Michel is a regular contributor on PBS NewsHour, CBS, MSNBC, CNBC, CNBC, C-SPAN, Netflix, and NPR, and the list could go on. He has written for and among various publications of note, including The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, and USA Today. In 2020, he published a great work called Last Mission to Tokyo. Tonight, he'll speak on his newest work, just released, The Light of Battle, Eisenhower, D-Day, and the Birth of an American Superpower. I really appreciate dearly all of your wonderful support for this institution. Appreciate you coming this evening, and I hope now that you will join me in a very warm welcome from Michel Paradis.
Good evening, and thank you really so much for the invitation to speak tonight. It's an incredible honor, and I hope to do 2 things by the end of my hopefully short talk tonight. One is to persuade you that Eisenhower is fascinating, which may sound like a strange thing to say, but I think certainly for people of my generation and many others, it's easy to take Eisenhower for granted. He's kind of everybody's granddad in some way, and I think that image that he certainly projected himself belies an utterly fascinating, complicated, really quite brilliant individual who stands apart among the great leaders of the 20th century and really deserves to be understood. And the second thing that I'll hope to persuade you, or at least describe to you, is how the seminal moment of Eisenhower's life, which is his leadership of the D-Day invasion, which we all know so well. We know the images of it. The story's been told many, many times, far better, frankly, than I can tell it ever. Was a seminal moment, not just in his career, where all of his talents, all of his ambition and influences, were just perfectly matched to the moment. It's also a turning point in the history of the world, and particularly the United States' role in that world. And to start with that second point that I hope to persuade you of, it's easy to forget what the world looked like in the beginning of World War II, in 1941, 1942, when the United States and Great Britain form an alliance. At the time, the military and economic alliance between the British Empire and the United States of America was broadly understood to be of a senior partner and a junior partner. And the British Empire very much was the senior partner in that relationship. It covered a quarter of the Earth's surface, depending on how you count, a quarter of the world's population. It was the guarantor of safety on the high seas through the Pax Britannica. It controlled international finance, insurance, and telecommunications through London. And from the very beginning of the war, it was understood that the United States was a large economy, to be sure, but certainly had never demonstrated that it had the wherewithal to be a major player in the world. It had not coincidentally gone to war with itself only 80 years earlier. It was made up of 48 very fractious states, and it by no means seemed even plausible that the United States could fulfill Roosevelt's promise at the beginning of the war of becoming the arsenal democracy. And the idea that the United States would in turn ever lead the world was an even remoter and almost comical idea, particularly to the British. And so my book starts where I think that probably one of the most underappreciated international summits of World War II, and that's the Cairo Conference. The Cairo Conference was held in 2 sessions at the end of November early December 1943, sandwiched around the Tehran conference, where Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin actually meet for the first time. And I point to the Cairo conference as a major turning point in not only the history of the war, but in the history of the world, because it's at the Cairo conference that the decision to finally launch Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, is made. And this is an incredibly contentious decision. From the very start of the war, the United States had advocated for a cross-channel invasion and a charge right to Berlin as the easiest way to knock the Nazis out of the war and then to turn fully onto the Pacific. The British, though, had their own ideas. Part of that was, based on very good, sound strategic reasoning. The British understood the weakness, particularly of America's battle strength at that time. They understood the strength of the Germans, the Wehrmacht on the other side. British military doctrine was heavily emphasized the use of air and sea power, where Britain was incredibly strong, and avoided land battles. Britain had, not coincidentally, the one time the British Army violated that rule was the First World War, which was catastrophic. And Britain also had its own empire to think about. And so the British, certainly with a lot of US material at their back, understood that, the Second World War was just the next European war. And Winston Churchill was very successful in redirecting Allied efforts in Europe in the first year and a half of the war to the really first 2 years of the war to the retaking of the Mediterranean by the Allies. And this led ultimately to the invasion of North Africa, then of Sicily, and then of the boot of Italy. And the Allies were gradually progressing their way up the boot of Italy. And Churchill had as his fundamental objective the complete taking of the Mediterranean by the Allies, which would have the simultaneous benefit of strangling the Nazis in Germany, allowing the Red Army to essentially bear the brunt of the ground fighting in Eastern Europe, and not coincidentally cutting the Soviets off from access to the Eastern Mediterranean, particularly in the Balkans, which Churchill understood as very much in the long-term interest, particularly of the British Empire, who always viewed the Soviet Empire with great suspicion. And why Cairo becomes significant is because by the time the conference is convened, the United States has changed, right? To the extent the United States was a fractious land of cowboys and immigrants in 1941, by November of 1943, the United States is outpacing the British by orders of magnitude in terms of military production. We're producing 2 to 3 times the number of airplanes, of tanks, seven times the number of ships as the Great British Navy. The United States not only constructed all of this military material in enormous factories that had been remobilized for war production, it did so with a smaller percentage of its economy than the entire British Empire. And in the course of the fighting over the previous 2 years, gradually built an international logistics network to get all of that stuff where it needed to be quickly and cheaply. And this, in turn, led to the invention of the cell phone and profoundly altered the balance of power between the British and the United States by the time they convene in Cairo in November of 1943, where, to the extent throughout the war, the assumption had always been that the Brits were the senior partner in the relationship. By November of 1943, that question is less clear, most of all to Winston Churchill himself, who understands the sands of history beginning to shift against the empire. And so he goes to Cairo to make one last stand against an investment in the cross-channel invasion, to fully commit the Allies to the invasion of Europe via the Mediterranean, for the long-term sort of health of the British Empire. And it's rare that you could say this as a historian, but if you read the notes and transcripts and minutes of the Cairo conference, it's incredibly entertaining, because you have men in their 60s by and large. George Marshall on the American side, a great Virginian. Sir Alan Brooke on the British side is the General Chief of Staff, having an argument about the future direction of the Second World War in Europe, and in the way it's recorded in the notes, nearly breaking out into a brawl. And And it's very difficult to imagine any other international summit where you literally have two of the world's greatest allies, like reaching across the table against each other over the future direction of the war. But those were the stakes. And I think the British understood that even more than the United States. That, though, left a question with the Allies. Long and short, the Cairo Conference resolves with a compromise. The Allies are going to essentially divide their forces, half of which to undertake Operation Overlord against the across the English Channel, the other half continuing operations in the Mediterranean. So they're going to essentially hedge their bets. But that in turn leaves a profound question: who's going to lead the Allied invasion of France? Who's going to be the commander on D-Day? And the understanding had been, really since the beginning of the war, that if and when this operation was ever launched, it would be George Marshall. He was, by all lights, probably the most respected man, military man in the world at this point. He was a truly nonpartisan figure, to the point where when he would go to Capitol Hill, Democrat or Republican, George Marshall could get what he wanted passed, unless he was asked, on whose behalf are you here? And if he said, I'm here on the president's behalf, he knew and would understand that in turn would kill the initiative right there. But if he said, no, this is something I want for the war, it would pass. But there were reasons to not send General Marshall to lead the operation in Europe. For one thing, it would be something of a demotion. Far more a celebrated position, perhaps, but a step down for someone who had been the chief of staff of the army. He truly was the indispensable man in Washington, and Roosevelt ultimately even tells him when he's ultimately not being given the assignment that I couldn't sleep without you in Washington. But another reason, which Roosevelt shares privately in some correspondence that I was able to find, is that he was worried about the thing that makes the Cairo Conference so interesting. Because all throughout the conference, it was Marshall who had to be the heavy in the fighting with the British over the future direction of the war. And Roosevelt, being Roosevelt, always would smile and make jokes and sort of move things along. But it got the atmosphere got so sort of acrimonious and poisonous that Roosevelt was genuinely concerned that the alliance couldn't sustain itself under General Marshall, that Marshall was essentially too principled and would be too hard of a nut for the British to tolerate. And so that left the problem of who to pick. And quite to most people's surprise, not the least being Dwight Eisenhower's, Franklin Roosevelt picks Eisenhower to lead Operation Overlord, to essentially be the top military general in Europe and to be the principal Allied commander in the European theater. And his selection of Eisenhower is strange for all sorts of reasons. One that most people know, Eisenhower literally has never fought in combat, never does. He has had a career in the Army as a staff officer. His talents, ultimately come only on full display really quite late into the North Africa campaign, which initially goes very poorly, to the point where Eisenhower in early 1943 is probably going to be replaced, but is kept in place primarily because his great singular talent is that people like him, most of all the British. There's something about Eisenhower, that sort of Eisenhower charm, that Eisenhower smile, and a real commitment to the alliance and the importance of winning the war, American distinctions between American and Brit or otherwise be damned, that endears Eisenhower to the British. In addition, Eisenhower's very sort of, I would say, Kansas avuncularity is deceiving to the British, right? Because this is a time where if you are an important, intelligent person, you do everything you can, like Winston Churchill, like Charles de Gaulle, the names go on, to convince everyone of how big, intelligent, and important you are at all times. And Eisenhower is a Kansan, right? There's I grew up in Appalachian, Pennsylvania, and we have a similar sort of cultural tick of always being embarrassed anytime someone says nice things about us, right? There's a humility, almost an ostentatious humility, that Eisenhower naturally embodies, but is able to use to incredible political effect. The question, though, because Roosevelt does not really know Eisenhower that well. They've met at a handful of occasions. Eisenhower really has never impressed Roosevelt up to this point. He knows that people like Eisenhower, but is he the kind of person with guile, with the sophistication, the poker playing ability to be someone who's really leading an international alliance to defeat the Nazis in Europe. And in anticipation of the Cairo conference, Roosevelt stops over in Tunisia and Algeria, where Eisenhower's headquarters are based, and has to stay over due to weather, and is given essentially a tour by Eisenhower of the battlefields around Carthage. And it's in this meeting, in this essentially weekend they spend together, that I'm convinced, and you don't have to be, but I'm convinced that Roosevelt actually sees Eisenhower in a different way for the very first time. And two things lead to that, in my view. One is that during this tour of the Carthaginian battlefields, which were also, the American and Allied battlefields during Tunisia, Eisenhower is able to give a down to the hill and rock and sort of grade explanation of how the war went in North Africa and how Hannibal's campaign unfolded. Because when Eisenhower was a little boy, he grew up in a religiously pacifist family in Kansas, in essentially a group of a religious community that's now called the Jehovah's Witnesses, but was much more sort of evangelical and even mystical at the end of the 19th century. And just as today, they were extremely pacifist, indeed anti-government, at the end of the 19th century. And Eisenhower, the middle child of a fairly basically subsistence farmers, was very curious and eager to learn about the wider world. And like many young men, found military history utterly fascinating from the very beginning, and was given a book, The Life of Hannibal, by the publisher of a local newspaper. And he brought this book home and started reading with great interest about the life of Hannibal. And his mother, a devout religious pacifist, caught him with this book and took it away from him and locked it in a closet. And so Eisenhower would wait until his mother went out to the garden to do work in the field, to then sneak into the closet and read The Life of Hannibal like he was sneaking a Playboy. And so Hannibal, if there was one general from history that Eisenhower knew better than any other with great intimacy, it was Hannibal. And so by essentially a stroke of luck, Roosevelt is asking about sort of openly wonders about the Battle of Zama, and Eisenhower can go with just as much detail, just as much finesse, just as much interest into that as the Battle of Tunisia that he had commanded only a year earlier. The second reason, though, that I think that I came to conclude that Roosevelt understood Eisenhower was a much cannier political operator than the sort of smiling Ike persona would let on, is Kay Summersby. You may know Kay Summersby if you know Eisenhower's biography at all. She was his long suspected mistress during the war, a fascinating figure in her own right, whose biography I won't belabor. But when Roosevelt comes to Tunisia to meet Eisenhower in advance of the Cairo conference, almost the first words out of his mouth are, "How's that Irish girl?" And really, throughout this entire weekend, the president of the United States is basically hazing Eisenhower to see if he will sort of crack under the pressure of sort of having his relationship with Kay Summersby sort of thrown in his face. To the point that Roosevelt, and I found this archival footage, which is a little grainy, but this is of the picnic between Eisenhower and Roosevelt during this tour of the Carthaginian battlefields. And if you look back at the very beginning of the footage, if you see the young woman sitting right there in the front seat, that's Kay Summersby, who Roosevelt insists on sort of bringing into every conversation, insists on having at their side the entire time. And the whole time, Eisenhower has, like, his smile essentially is probably the most lethal poker face Roosevelt has ever seen. And so it's in this weekend I came to believe, and I paint this with more detail in the book, that Roosevelt comes to really understand some of the talents that Eisenhower is very capable of concealing. And his willingness even to conceal his talents, I think, becomes incredibly important, particularly to the rise of the United States as a global superpower and to the success ultimately of the D-Day invasion. There are a number of things I do see I'm cutting through my time quickly, so I'll have to skip over a few things that, if you're interested, I'm happy to discuss in the Q&A. But I'll give two examples that I think demonstrate Eisenhower's unique talents that literally lead directly to the success of D-Day and ultimately the success of the United States as the inheritor of the position of global superpower from the British Empire. The first is the planning of the D-Day operation itself. The Allies had been producing plans. It was called the Cossack Plan, for what an invasion of Normandy would look like. And over the course of that year, British planners had done a very detailed job, but it was a very small plan that's primary objective was the capture of the northern French city of Caen, which is the largest city in Normandy and is surrounded by fields which at the time were believed would make for good airfields. Eisenhower gets this plan, which has a commitment of, I think, about 3 divisions in the first wave, and immediately sees that this is going to be a catastrophe if this is the Allies' plan. It's way too small. It's on a very narrow front. Not only will the Germans be able to concentrate their forces at a very small point in northern France, with anywhere from 3/4 to 1 million German forces deployable within about a week, the Allies will be committed to a very, very essentially small bottleneck in terms of being able to build up their own forces from Britain across the Channel into France. And so he sees right away that the initial plan, the plan that the combined chiefs of staff at the Cairo conference agreed to implement, that he has been given to implement, will not work. And so he decides that they have to essentially double the size of the operation, not only in terms of manpower, but in its geographic scope, so that it goes all the way over to include what's now called Omaha and Utah beaches. The problem with this, though, as you might imagine, is given that this plan was approved by the combined chiefs of staff only after a great gnashing of teeth and rending of garments between the British and the Americans, right, proposing immediately, not only are we going to, this plan inadequate, we're going to need to double the Allied commitment to the invasion of Normandy, is just asking for diplomatic trouble, right? An American general immediately coming in and saying we have to double the Allies' commitment to the thing the British do not want to do to begin with is doomed to fail and could potentially even cause a catastrophic rift in the North Atlantic Alliance. But understanding the need to do this against a very dug-in German enemy, Eisenhower realizes that this idea has to come from the British. While he's working on this plan, though, he's told, not quite over his objections, but certainly without his support, that his top British commander, the British ground commander, is a guy named Bernard Montgomery, who, for lack of a better word, has always hated Eisenhower, and whom Eisenhower always hates in return. The very first time they meet, Eisenhower is on a fact-finding expedition in the spring of 1942, goes into a briefing that Montgomery is conducting. Eisenhower's a chain smoker. He gets up to about 3 packs a day by the time D-Day comes around. Pulls out a cigarette, is smoking. Montgomery, in a room not unlike this one, stops, like calls out and says, "Who's smoking?" And Eisenhower raises his hand. He's like, "I do not allow smoking in my offices." And so Eisenhower has to sort of put his cigarette out and just let the flame burn inside of him for the next several years. Montgomery, though, is often derided, particularly by American historians, because he is kind of insufferable in his own way, but is also quite brilliant as well. And so Eisenhower understands that Bernard Montgomery, who's a major protege of Sir Alan Brooke, the Marshall's counterpart on the British staff, is key to the success of this expansion of the Overlord plan. And so right after Christmas, before anyone has returned to London, Eisenhower invites Montgomery to his headquarters in Tunisia, in Algeria, and sits down with Monty and says, Monty, you've been put in charge of the British and Canadian forces, and I'm sure looking forward to that. But you know what? I'd like you to be in charge of the American forces too. Now, mind you, this is something that he does not have the authority to promise. Indeed, George Marshall is deeply opposed to this idea. George Marshall wants an American sector and a British sector. He does not want the armies mixing. But Eisenhower has asked if he can essentially create a unified commander, and Marshall has not yet said no. And so he proposes to Montgomery, I would like you to be the overall commander. Don't you think Bernard Montgomery of El Alamein deserves to be the commanding general of Operation Overlord? And Bernard Montgomery quite predictably says, yes, Bernard Montgomery certainly should be the man to command both all Allied forces in Europe. And then with that sort of, offer accepted, Eisenhower then says, now here's the current plan. Don't you think this plan's a little too small for Montgomery of Alamein? And Montgomery of Alamein, sure enough, is like, absolutely, this plan is much too small. We should double it. And Eisenhower was like, I couldn't agree more. And so he sends Monty back to London to essentially reformulate the plan. And Monty does, actually, to great effect. And it has a way of just knocking heads together bureaucratically that I think is impressive on its own. Comes up with a new plan that is forever known as the Montgomery Plan, but becomes the plan that that D-Day, the plan for D-Day that we know today. And so when the plan is proposed, particularly to the British chiefs of staff for approval, the Montgomery Plan obviously is a much better brand for a vast expansion of the Operation Overlord than certainly the Eisenhower or the American plan would have been. I'm running up towards the end of my time, and I do want to stop and take your questions, but I'll talk about one more thing that I think is incredibly important. And I'll click through quickly, some of the films that, from this period. But Eisenhower really, in this 6 months, learns to do everything that a future American president would have to learn. Because over the course of the next 6 months, 1.5 million Americans pour into the British Isles. Tens of thousands of tons of military equipment and just human equipment are also brought in, clogging British ports, becoming enormous sort of diplomatic and just economic burden on the British Empire. One of the most significant, frankly, is the civil rights problem, something I frankly had neither thought about nor even heard about until I started reading Eisenhower's sort of daily log of troubles, which is one of the main ways I tried to write this book, because they brought in about 10% of American forces in England or in Great Britain were black. And this was a segregated army in 1942. And the British were deeply opposed to American-style segregation. And this created all sorts of problems that Eisenhower, as the American commander-in-chief, had to negotiate. Essentially, how is it that the United States is fighting a war against fascism and for equality with a segregated army? They have plenty of negotiations. He has to negotiate essentially with the French and the French resistance, which is made all the more complicated by the fact that as much as he and Bernard Montgomery have never seen eye to eye, Franklin Roosevelt and Charles de Gaulle literally can't be in the same room together. They genuinely hate each other. But Eisenhower knows that de Gaulle essentially is the only game in town for collaborating or cooperating with the French. So he ends up doing a lot of things that his superiors probably wouldn't necessarily have approved of. But I think the most significant, in terms of educating Eisenhower as the future leader of the free world, is using covert action. Because one of the ways that Eisenhower ultimately is able to develop his relationship with de Gaulle and the French in particular is by getting control over the Office of Strategic Services and then reallocating enormous amounts of resources that he is not officially allowed to provide the French through his military channels, through the OSS channels, to essentially foster the French resistance in support of the D-Day operations. The Germans continue to keep building up the Atlantic Wall, is what they called it, which is a series of defenses and fortifications and booby traps and mines that are designed to essentially destroy any invading force. The one that I'll mention, because it was, again, something that was totally new to me, but it was fascinating and really quite, it really sort of emphasized the burdens of leadership, is nuclear weapons. And there's an afternoon, it's about a month and a half before D-Day, is scheduled to launch. And George Marshall sends Eisenhower a message, you have to meet with this guy I'm sending you, which happened fairly regularly, to be perfectly frank. But what made this meeting unusual is that Eisenhower had to meet with the man alone. And the man who came to meet with him was a major in the army. which in this context is extremely low, right? People literally filling the coffee cups for Eisenhower are generals. And so the idea that Eisenhower is to sit down with the major is just weird. But and to give you a sense of how much Eisenhower was looking forward to and took this meeting seriously, he scheduled it for a Saturday afternoon, right, to sort of be over and done with because Marshall told him to. But this man comes in, he says, "Hi, I'm Dr. Alan Peterson. I'm from something called the Manhattan District Project. And we have been developing nuclear weapons in the United States. The Germans are doing the same exact thing. We don't think the Germans have an operating bomb yet, but they do know how to make radiological weapons, what we would now call dirty bombs. And we've done experiments over the course of the last summer. And if the Germans are essentially sprinkling radioactive material along the Normandy beaches as one of the fortifications for the Atlantic Wall, your men will, suffer casualties like you can't imagine. If they're standing on the beach for a day, depending on the concentration, they'll most likely develop radiation sickness and die. Smaller levels will result in lower levels of radiation poisoning, cancers, and morbidity. You can't see it. You can't do anything to defend yourself. Oh, and by the way, you can't tell anyone what I just told you. And it wasn't quite as strict as that, but he said, look, only people with a real need to know can be told that this is even happening. And we're going to be monitoring for signs of radiation, but there's nothing you can do about it. And there's no one you can really tell about it. And Eisenhower initially actually wants to tell, Bernard Montgomery and his other top generals who are going to be crossing those beaches, and then decides against it, because they don't need to know, right? Just as there's nothing he can do about it, there's nothing they can do about it either. And so he's basically says, this is a worry of mine, not of theirs. And we know it was a worry of his, despite the very scrupulous non-record keeping around this issue, because he sends this very cryptic message to Marshall just a few weeks before the invasion saying, so I met with that major a couple of weeks ago. Anything you want to tell me? Is there any new developments? And here's nothing back. All he knows based on this major, this major has told him is there's they estimate about a 10% chance that the Germans will be deploying nuclear weapons. And so all of this just weighs on him in the lead up to D-Day. And with all of the other things that he has to deal with, whether or not it's America's civil rights problem in the United Kingdom, the increasing friction with a growing American with sort of a growing American presence on the world stage, with Britain's anxieties about its own empire, with the actual just planning of D-Day, with the dealing with things like nuclear weapons and the beach obstacles, dealing with the French. This all the while he commits to projecting optimism and ultimately really just taking his role as a leader seriously. The very Eisenhower smile that's almost a cliche, and he almost uses, I think, as probably his greatest weapon, certainly in diplomatic realm, is also his way of projecting optimism to people who are taking astronomical risks to themselves. And I think, there's a lot I could say, but the one I think that is the most poignant is when he goes out the night before the launch of the D-Day invasion. He meets with the 101st Airborne, and these guys are the same age, basically, if not younger than his own son, who as life would have it, is actually graduating from West Point on D-Day himself. And he goes just young man to young man, shaking their hands and, just smiling and, saying, that's the stuff, you got it, you can do this. At one point, his worries must have been apparent to one of them, because they say, don't worry, General, we got this. And he literally makes a point of shaking every one of looking them in the eye as he shakes their hands. Now, he's shaken a lot of hands by this point, but he looks each of them in the eye. And this is after being told of not only all of those risks that I just mentioned, but given early reports, intelligence reports about German movements that pose a risk of basically creating a 50% killed in action rate amongst the airborne forces. Like every other hand he shakes is a boy who he has been given reason to believe is going to jump to their death. And he looks them in the eye because he's there for them, right? It's not for him. It's not a parade. It's just, he's there for them to make them feel safer. D-Day obviously is a success. It's a resounding success. It's far more of a an Allied victory than anyone could have estimated at the time. And so that within a week, Eisenhower is actually able to go to Normandy himself, along with George Marshall and the American chiefs of staff. And this is another piece of archival footage that I was able to find of Eisenhower stepping onto France for the very first time, getting off these are called ducks, like the duck boats you can go on in Boston. And I love this video for lots of reasons, as you might expect. But the biggest one is just the smile and like the look on his face, like just of the sense of the earth underneath him after all of this had transpired. And there he is smoking one of his many 3-packs a day. But the last point, and this does get ultimately, I think, to why America became a superpower and why Eisenhower was indispensable to that, is that in his speeches announcing the invasion, both to the troops, which many of you may have read, it's a very famous speech, but also to Europe. They make announcements. He makes an announcement to the people of Europe that the Allies are coming. And at no point does he ever say the United States, not once, actually. It's quite remarkable. It's always the United Nations, which was the name of the Allies. And he always talks in terms of liberation instead of conquest. Indeed, he gets early reports back from the field saying, such and such territory in France has been conquered. And he sends a memo down, all the way down, saying, we are not conquering anything, we are liberating it. Now, part of that is good PR, for sure. But I think that's also a commitment to a very new kind of idea of power in the world that's built on allies, that's built on values, that's built on not the aggrandizement of an empire, even a liberal empire like the British Empire, but on a shared commitment to a global team, is certainly what Eisenhower would call it. And I think that made the United States just perfectly able under the leadership of someone like Dwight Eisenhower, who embodied those values, to take the mantle of leadership in 1945, because people around the world not only understood American power, but they invited it in many places where, because it broke with something that had done them very little favors in the past. And so D-Day really is this birth in the American superpower, the rise of America as a superpower. It's this moment where America proves that this kind of allied, directed, values-based international affairs can actually work, right? It's not just something that sounds good in propaganda, but it actually works because it did probably the most difficult, complex, high-risk military operation maybe in human history, was the fruit of it. And so here's Eisenhower and Marshall just chatting right after that visit to Normandy. But that is hopefully I proved both of those things, that Eisenhower was way more interesting than his aw shucks smile can let on. And that also that D-Day and Eisenhower really were essential to America becoming the kind of place, certainly that I grew up. And so now I'm happy to take your questions, because I know I've gone a few minutes over long. Thanks.
You mentioned that, forgetting El Alamein for now, you mentioned that Montgomery was brilliant. I can think of several episodes in which cannot think episode in which he was.
Sure. No, I'm happy to take that question. And maybe I lived in the United Kingdom for a while, so my use of the word brilliant is probably a little more profligate than it used to be. No, I think Montgomery's real talents were as a leader of men and as a military planner. And I think it's very difficult to take either of those things away from him, as much as I am happy to criticize, including how he ended up fighting the Battle of Normandy later. And Eisenhower would also be probably the first person to say both of those things. But certainly as a leader of men, there are few, certainly in the British context, few generals that had as much genuine affection from their subordinates than Bernard Montgomery did. And that was not just a matter of celebrity. It's because Montgomery really did care about his men. He used to say that my chaplains are as important as my field generals, because it's ultimately about leading men into battle and to take the ultimate risk to themselves for a greater cause than themselves. And so Monty had just fundamental, I think, love for his men, to be perfectly frank. But I think a fundamental understanding that armies are led by people. And so that, I think, is something that is unique. And Eisenhower admired it incredibly and actually stole lots of Monty's like morale tricks from that he watched Monty do. So, I'll give you one example, but military reviews typically are a very formal, stiff affair where the general sort of parades and everyone has to stand in the rain uncomfortably for a while. And Monty always sort of had this way of, after they would do the 5-minute presentation, he'd just say, "Okay, come on over, and I want to talk to you," and break ranks, and he would just then mingle through his men. And Eisenhower saw him doing this and was like, "That's brilliant." And so Eisenhower basically picked up that same sort of style and that same idea. So I think Monty deserves credit for that. And I also think, as a military planner, I think there was no one who, particularly in the military bureaucracy that existed in the United Kingdom in the early 1940s, who could have done the revisions to what became the Operation Overlord Plan, other than Montgomery, because a lot of the things that made Monty completely impossible to work over were essential characteristics in a very hierarchical, stiff, consensus-based bureaucracy like the British military in the early 1940s. I could and shouldn't go on about this, but I'm fully aware of Montgomery's shortcomings, particularly on the battlefield. But I think he had some advantages too, or some talents as well.
Yeah. Question over here. As a historian, I'm wondering if you've noticed that there's been a reevaluation of Eisenhower and also Grant going on in historical, and both being Midwest type people. I'm wondering what you thought about that's going on in the historiography recently. And second, the stories we've heard about Eisenhower's response to the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, and whether or not that actually occurred that way, that he was able to detect quite early on that it was not just a local counterattack, it was actually something that was, a counteroffensive that to strategically change the course of the war in the West.
Sure. So, with respect to the Ardennes offensive, no, I do think that's right. And I'll just sort of share this. It's not in the book, and it's sort of off the record, but this is a large group. So some of the sources I interviewed actually were sort of old generals and military types who had, and they had a lot of, apparently there was a lot of, I'll just say, negativity towards Omar Bradley's handling of that Bradley just both didn't foresee it and then got very overwhelmed, and that Eisenhower was actually quite close to relieving him of command, and then took much. So Eisenhower, I think, had much more sang-froid, so to speak, in that situation, and did understand the implications, I think, a lot earlier than many other people did. But getting to your first question about historiography, and yeah, I do think Eisenhower has gotten greater appreciation. I think Grant's greater appreciation is probably thanks almost exclusively to Ron Chernow, because Ron Chernow is a brilliant writer, and so I give him full credit. But Eisenhower's, I would say, is actually probably based on two things that have occurred to me in thinking about making a similar observation, that people seem to actually like Ike now more than they did in the 60s. One is that we've had historians have had time, particularly careful historians have had time to actually get into the Eisenhower archives with much greater depth than was true certainly in the 1960s and even 80s. So that you can still find lots of new stuff. And what consistently, I think, is revealed is just that Eisenhower, I'm not saying he was two-faced, but he had a public face that was this sort of smiling avuncular Ike figure that was a sort of veneer on top of a really quite sophisticated, complex, brilliant in many situations mind. And so as a historian, right, you get to find all that stuff later. And so I think to the extent there's a certain strain, particularly in academic historians, that is suspicious of people who don't want to look smart. And Eisenhower was not one of those people, right? He suffered that, I think, in his lifetime, right? The Adlai Stevenson-Eisenhower dichotomy is alive and well today. But the more you actually get into Eisenhower and dig under the surface, I think he reveals himself to be a much more complex, sophisticated, interesting person than he ever presented himself for being and was ever assumed to be. But I think the other thing is that Eisenhower is also, you know, I don't know how to put this exactly, but he's like an adult. He's a serious person who was a leader in at a time of genuine crisis, both internationally and domestically, right? We think about how divided the country is now, and we hear about that on the news all the time. But you know, one of the benefits of being a historian is you can go to the past, and that had nothing on the 30s, and we had nothing on the 30s and 40s in level of just vitriol, the violence, and that's just domestically. And then you deal with that internationally. And so someone who is able to kind of just maintain a commitment to, you know, to duty, to, you know, a cause greater than themselves, and to make it work, right? I think is something that we probably are nostalgic for these days. And I think that's one of the reasons that his appreciation has gone up, his stock has gone up over time, so to speak.
I got a question over here. As I read a lot of stuff on Eisenhower, stuff he also told himself, he actually told. He had a very interesting relationship with Marshall, and he was eager to get into the war, and Marshall kept holding him back and said, wait, and then finally released him from his little prison in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And I wondered about what you found out about the relationship between Marshall and Eisenhower.
Yeah, they have one of the probably best mentor-mentee relationships, you know, that I've certainly seen. And Marshall, so Eisenhower starts working for Marshall in December of 41, right after Pearl Harbor, primarily because one of the members of Marshall's planning staff dies in a freak plane accident, and so Eisenhower has to get shipped over to Washington to be on his planning staff. At this point, Marshall has heard good things from people, but Eisenhower's main demerit, and I promise not to spend the rest of our time talking about it, certainly in Marshall's eyes, was that he had been Douglas MacArthur's right hand for the previous decade. And Marshall and MacArthur are almost, you know, the two opposite people of the period in almost every measurable way. And so Eisenhower gets onto Marshall's staff, and you know, one of the personal sort of interpersonal skills that I think Eisenhower has, that I read about a fair bit in the book, is he understands mentorship. He cultivates mentors extremely well, and it's partly with the same sort of things I was talking about. He has a, you know, almost he literally was a football coach, but a football coach's idea of like, you're not here to see the coach, you're here to win the game. And so he's always like very mission focused. And as a consequence, even when he's like furious in his diary at Marshall and like, you know, spitting vinegar because Marshall has told him that he's going to spend the rest of the war at his desk and he's not going to get promoted and he's just going to sit there as some flunky in Washington, you know, he still goes into the office every day and does his job to the absolute best. Like there's a level of just self-discipline that I think Marshall learned, if not immediately saw, certainly learned to understand and respect. So that when it came time to send someone to England to, you know, initially sort of be the toehold in Europe, to be Marshall's guy really in Europe, to set the stage for what would become the D-Day invasion, he knew he could trust Eisenhower to do what he wanted him to do and not try and, you know, go his own way. And as a consequence, they were very close. They were never buddies. And to the day he died, Eisenhower always called him General Marshall. But it's an incredibly profound relationship. And the last thing I'll say about it is, at the very, very end of his life, Eisenhower kind of starts working on his own memoir, actually, of this period, which is really revealing in a way that sort of thing can only be, like when it's unpublished and it's still the early drafts. And his working title for it was Churchill and Marshall, because I think he very much understood those as the two poles of mentorship and leadership that he sort of came through to become who he was.
Yeah, I was really appreciative of the footage you found on Eisenhower stepping onto French soil. I'm curious if you could make a comment about his relationship with the media and the press and the PR, particularly contrast to MacArthur, whom you just mentioned, who, when he returned to the Philippines, had a highly choreographed set of pictures made.
Yeah. So Eisenhower was very, very good at a political. I'll call it a political trick, and I don't mean that too pejoratively, but a political trick that I think comes to define a lot of like 20th century American politics. Of oh, you don't want to be paying attention to me. Isn't this all just silly, right? He has this as someone who's Gen X, right? He has this almost ironic view of the media, which is actually often quite entertaining. But he also knows how to cultivate the media really, really well. And so there's an element of performance to it, but it's not the performance of someone like Douglas MacArthur, who's going to have 15 takes of him walking into the ocean until he gets the best one. It's a sort of a sophistication of like, he's very chummy with the press, and as a consequence, the press are very chummy with him too, and he understands that very well. And he uses the press to great effect as a consequence. Whereas I think the press was always much more eager to screw over Douglas MacArthur when they had the opportunity than certainly they were with Eisenhower.
Can you say something about the relationship between General Eisenhower and General Patton?
Yeah,
because he was a
friends.
Real personality here.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, they have a very deep and like close, almost brotherly friendship that goes back to the late teens, early 20s, when they meet in Fort Meade when they're both tank commanders. Eisenhower spent the First World War in Gettysburg, training people how to use tanks that didn't actually exist in Gettysburg. But Patton actually got to use tanks during his some French tanks when he was on the Western Front in World War I. And so they're both big believers in tanks, but they also become incredibly like fast brotherly friends. They both have a sort of bit of a cowboy. They actually go on like I don't even know how to describe these, but they first of all, they bootleg a lot of gin, but and I'm not saying they drank this gin before doing this, but they would go out onto like the back roads around in Maryland looking for bandits, right, to see if they could get into a gunfight. And there aren't that many bandits even then around Fort Meade in Maryland. So they're basically like two guys. And if there's one thing that I think Eisenhower's reputation certainly has completely washed out of his personality is the extent to which he was kind of just a guy, is what we would say today, right? He was a football player. He was a bit of a jock, and he swore profusely, which is not very consistent with the modern image of him. And so he and Patton were like thick as thieves. And during the war, that relationship is both professional, but also complicated by the fact that Patton, not unlike Montgomery, is almost an impossible subordinate to have. But Eisenhower goes well out of his way a few times. The slapping incident, I'm sure, is one that you're all familiar with, but there were others as well, to kind of protect Patton, both because I think they're good buddies, but also because Patton was a singular American military figure of the period and could be used to great effect for just for the psychological terror value that Patton tended to have on the Germans. So.
Okay, that's everything we're going to have time for tonight. Michel is going to be in Commonwealth Hall immediately after the lecture, signing copies of his book, which are available in the gift shop. So let's all give him a massive round of applause.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you for the wonderful.